It's time now for Empowered Family Talk with Francita Holris.
Do you want to empower families and young people in your community? Then take the time to make a tax-deductible contribution to the Coach Tate Fund. The Coach Tate Foundation is dedicated to helping young people and their families in learning and passing on the kinds of life skills that we all need to succeed. All too often, we hear about kids and their families having encountered life's difficulties that could have been easily avoided by knowing better decision-making skills, from anger management to money management to something as simple as learning to manage how we spend our time or how we use our job skills. Make a donation to the Coach Tate Fund. It'll help kids who need help and their families too. Make your contribution to the Coach Tate Fund. Get details at www.coachtatefoundation.com. And oh, by the way, thank you.
May the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Good morning. It's family time, and welcome back to Empower Family Talk on Praise 107.9, right here in the beautiful sunshine state of Jacksonville, Florida. We the people paying it forward in this 21st century as we balance these scales of justice within our real estate, our energy sources. Are we ready? I am delighted to be joined by my energy industry and radio broadcasting colleague, Mr. Jay Dauenhauer. Jay is the host of the Energy Cast podcast, now in its fourth year. Jay was a news producer before moving to the energy sector. He has been an executive director of a fracking industry, capturing carbon in Texas. Served as a project manager in fracking industry, and now serves as a project manager for transmissions in the Carolinas. Welcome to Empower Family Talk, Mr. Jay Dauenhauer.
Hey, Francita, how you doing? So great to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you for being here, and with the busy schedule, we've had a lot of interest in the subject of energy sources, and so I want to share a brief preamble that we've received from our family listeners. They say, in times like these, when our families are quarantined with stay-at-home orders, their attention has been focused on the energy sources coming into their home and their work environment. And the pandemic crisis, they have many questions about the quality and reliability of their energy sources, which includes their air quality, transmission, piping, and living off the grid has become an option for near future and its sustainability over a period of time. Now, Jay, you and I have had several conversations about our energy sources, and we have questions that I'd like to present to you from our listeners. If you could share the benefits and challenges of our energy sources today, which include climate change and its role within our energy output. Mr. Dauenhauer, please.
Yes. Well, Francine, thanks again. You know, this is a really interesting time, especially with COVID. And I recently spoke at Con Edison, who is the utility up in New York City. I wanted to get a viewpoint on what they were dealing with, because, of course, they were hit hard. And from the communication standpoint, one of the things that really stood out was this idea that, yes, while COVID is a crisis, and it's really tough on the healthcare workers and all of our really dedicated frontline workers and everybody, it really wasn't a crisis of, it isn't a crisis of reliability for the utility industry. Because, look, I mean, unlike things like big hurricanes that we see down in Florida or up in New York where they have those winter storms all the time. In New York, they had a blackout in 2003, took the city out. They had Hurricane Sandy on their end. They're not really facing reliability issues. It's kind of business as usual. They've been careful. They've socially distanced and worn the mask like everybody's supposed to do. So in that case, they're not really having problems with reliability. They're kind of, I guess, on the happy side of the ledger, like those telecoms like AT&T, people like Netflix. You know, they're kind of on the happy side of the ledger there. And
Right.
so I think they're able to kind of keep calm and carry on for everybody else while everyone else is really having, the real challenges. So I think that's the good news that we get through this, through the COVID pandemic.
Well, and that's very important in this day and time with COVID, because a lot of our families now are working from home, and the energy sources there, including the air quality, water quality, is very important. Can you share with our listeners what makes their energy sources clean?
Yeah, and one of the things that I said a lot, Francita, one of the reasons I wanted to do my podcast, Energy Cast, was, look, when I started back in 2017, Climate Cast was taken, Solar Cast was taken, but not Energy Cast. And so I've noticed that a lot of folks want to talk about wind and solar, and energy efficiency, and they only want to talk about climate change. But, what about nuclear? Nuclear is carbon-free. In fact, they recently shuttered some nuclear plants up in Pennsylvania, and the statistic I was told by the Office of Nuclear Energy at the Department of Energy was that will offset all of the energy gains made by all of the renewable energy in the last 20 years. And as you know, most of the renewable energy that we've brought onto the grid was wind and solar over probably the last 20 years. That's stuff that's not being discussed. In Georgia, they're about to open 2 more nuclear power plants for the first time in a generation. That's exciting news. And those are some of the energy sources that I think that we need to look at that, yes, are clean. They may not necessarily be renewable, but they shouldn't be ignored. I got my start, as you said in the intro. I was executive director of a clean coal technology foundation in Texas, and that was basically the idea that you would take coal plants and capture that CO2. Well, if you can capture CO2 from a coal plant, the only thing that's really coming out of the coal plant at that point is steam. Water vapor. The scrubbers basically take care of all the other things that come out. And so what I like to say is look, let's take all of the sources of energy that we've got out there and see what we can do to take away the negatives with each of them. And I think that when you change that math, then the energy selection that's available is really much more compelling than, okay, well, let's just do the stuff that's not emitting CO2 on its own, right? There's a lot more options there when you take away some of those negatives that are traditionally associated with a lot of different energy sources.
Well, I like what you said about nuclear because that salt molten reactor is a new and upcoming thing with nuclear that produces a near zero carbon footprint for our citizens. Is that correct? Is that your understanding?
I believe so. Yeah, I think this is what we were all calling, correct me if I'm wrong, the Gen 4 nuclear fleet. Aren't we in like a Gen 3.5 or something? Isn't that how we understand it? Yeah, Gen 4. And then there's also the stuff, the Department of Energy, they approached me about this time last year. I got to speak with one of the undersecretaries for the Office of Nuclear Energy. And he was pushing the small modular reactors. Have you guys talked about that on the program? I know that's getting into a lot of science.
Well, it is a lot of science, but the small modular reactors is a new reality in our energy source. So if you want to elaborate on that just a little more, that would be great, because our families really want to understand what are the energy sources out there and what is the quality and their reliability of fueling their homes with light, air, and cooling and heating. That's the main concern, whether it's nuclear. A lot of utilities are looking at solar. There's wind power. But we have a stability of over 100 years with nuclear. So can you share with our listeners, transmission versus producing energy at home and what's available for us?
Yeah, well, let's start with the small modular reactors, because that's something that's not really getting a whole lot of play, which I think has a lot of potential. At least the Department of Energy really seems to think so from what they've told me. Now, small modular reactor, so imagine, we've all maybe seen pictures of nuclear plants, and they're ginormous, right? Especially those large stacks and everything. They really capture the imagination. And a lot of these reactors are good to make about 1,000 megawatts of power, which is huge. Now, these small modular reactors are about 1/10 that size. Don't hold me to that. But the idea is you're basically taking a nuclear reactor, and shrinking it down. And so then you have a lot more options about making it modular. You can put them in series at a single location. You can have some producing power and others producing steam just for steam's sake, or desalinating water. I know in Florida, you're facing the Atlantic and everything, and the Gulf of Mexico. So they really think it's kind of a Swiss Army knife, and they're really excited about it because it also allows them to not have all of that, constrictive regulatory component. I mean, one of the biggest problems with getting a nuclear plant up and going is just all of the regulation and everything. And these SMRs, as we understand it, are a little bit more self-contained. They won't fail if there's no water in the system. I think that's what happened with Fukushima. That was one of the problems that happened there. So there's a lot of promise there, and I really would like to see a lot more interest publicly about that, as well as, what we see from the wind and solars out there.
Exactly. We need more education in nuclear energy, for sure, within our local communities. So when they see those big power plants and those big facilities there and storage facilities, they understand how their lights and heating and cooling is being activated and running to their homes. Now, Jay, I'd like you to address this question, if you could. A lot of families now are preparing to live off the grid, and they're asking a question. What is the difference in producing their own energy at home versus having a transmission service?
Certainly. Well, as I said, I work in the transmission sector. And look, Francina, until I started about 2.5 years ago, and I've been working in oil and gas before that, and I was on the trade association with coal. So I've kind of seen a lot of different things going on in the energy sector, and I really didn't fully appreciate what transmission and distribution really offer until I got to see it from this standpoint. And I can tell you that, look, I think we think that it doesn't take a whole lot to bring electricity to your homes, but there's a massive infrastructure there that is trying to bring you affordable power the most efficient way possible. And I can really stand by that. And so I think when people talk about making power on their own, I think that, that's all a great thing. Rooftop solar, you can have your own batteries in the garages and all that. We've seen all that. I wonder sometimes if it's really necessary to go from this, I'm just going to make all the power at my home, right, to I don't need the grid. And I don't think that's really necessary. That just seems like a lot of consumption of a lot of resources that kind of redundant. And, look, you think about it, the customer minutes interrupted, I think is how they measure it. How much time are you really without power with your utilities? It's 99.999% of the time you've got power uninterrupted, right? So I think that's right. I don't think utilities get enough credit for that. And, they're making massive investments all over the country from one utility to the next. Con Ed was talking about that. That was one of the things that they were really pushing to get that message out right before COVID hit, and it was all COVID all the time. But look, the money is really being spent right now by utilities on grid infrastructure upgrades because there's not really much of a call, I think, to invest a lot in generation, new nuclear plants, new coal plants. No one's building a coal plant right now. So the place to spend money is transmission, and they're doing this all over the place. A lot of these substations and stuff have stuff that's older than you or I. It needs to be replaced. It needs to be upgraded. There's a lot of modern computers, relay equipment and all that that needs to be upgraded, that would be vulnerable, cyber attacks and all that. We know all these things. That needs to be upgraded everywhere, and it is. And when you're able to do that, then I think that you have a lot more resilient grid out there, and I think that's really what's been going on all around the country.
I do too. I've been in nuclear security for over 18 years. We've learned a lot about the necessity for upgrades. We have about 350 million people living here in the United States, about 10 billion worldwide. And if we look at our infrastructure, such as the critical infrastructure of our power sources, we certainly have a lot to say about the good things that are happening with nuclear. Now, Jay, let me ask you this question from one of our families. And it sounds like it's preparedness. We have a quality system, infrastructure in place. But what happens when that grid goes down? And how the families need to be prepared and ready to sustain their lives until they have electricity and power again in their homes and businesses.
Yeah, that's a good point. And look, I know that the industry is working to ensure that a lot of things like cyber attacks or, God forbid, EMP attacks don't happen. But yeah, when it comes down to the homes, look, I mean, I really do think the home is where it is most important, and to have a strong family structure at home, that's of course very important. As far as power is concerned, I can definitely tell you, batteries and the flashlights and everything, and if you got the means, maybe shell out for a diesel generator. But yeah, I think that for the most part, I think the utilities are really working to ensure that there won't be long-term outages. And I think we've seen that. I mean, one of the things that happens is that whenever there's a hurricane, the utilities all have this agreement. I believe it's the American Power Producers Association. That They have a coordinated effort where they will send the trucks from outside the region to the places that are hardest hit. They sent trucks to Puerto Rico. I think there was a little bit of an issue during that storm in Puerto Rico where Puerto Rico had maybe been opted out of that agreement, and that was one of the reasons that Puerto Rico had such a hard time getting back online. But that system works pretty well in the event of storms and whatever may befall a community that would have the power out for a long time.
Well, here in Florida, there's always areas where Mother Nature has her way. And here in Florida, you've got the hurricanes and different weather. We call it climate change. Can you share with our families what is it that our climate change folks seem to ignore?
What is ignoring?
The climate change, folks that are in charge of our climate change. What are they ignoring in this process?
Look, I like to say, I've thought about this a lot. I've done a lot of soul searching since I've done this podcast about climate change. And one of the things that I really don't like to talk about climate change too much because what hasn't been said, by people who I think care about it more. One of the things I like to say is, look, what are we going to do about carbon emissions? Right. And that's one of the reasons why I'm like, look, why aren't you looking at nuclear? If you really cared about this, wouldn't you be more pro-nuclear? And I had a guest on who had a book called A Bright Future, and he was I guarantee he's probably never worn anything other than Birkenstocks with a suit, if he ever had to wear one. He was about as granola as it gets, but that guy was ardently pro-nuclear, right, and pro-climate action. One of the things that I like to say with climate change is, look, it's not as nuanced as there's just a one-size-fits-all view of this. I kind of like to call it the chicken and the ostrich, right? You're either Chicken Little and you think the sky is falling. Those are the most ardent, we're going to die tomorrow. We're past the point where no return as far as carbon emissions. We're done. And then there's the ostrich, right? You're kind of putting your head in the sand. You're not paying attention to any of it. You don't want to even acknowledge that anything's going on with CO2 emissions or climate. And I think that people are really somewhere in the middle between the chicken and the ostrich, right? We know there needs to be something done, but we're maybe not religiously on either end of that spectrum.
That's correct. And as we move forward into this new age of our energy sources, I'm a big proponent for nuclear, as you know, and it's ever upgrading of that grid, which is very important for our families to understand. And so with that, what advice would you be able to share with our listeners to pay attention to what's emerging in our energy sources and how to make an informed decision on what they have transmitted into their homes for air, heating, and cooling?
Yeah, well, most of the time it's not up to the consumer, right? What they want to, what exactly they want coming in. I mean, it's going to be whatever is coming is on the grid, right? Just whatever percentage of the portfolio is. That's pretty much what's coming. I have profiled a few companies out there that offer what we call retail electric providers, basically the people you pay your bill to. These are mainly in deregulated states like Texas and I believe California. You can sign up for renewable-only plans, and I always felt like that was a little bit short-sighted. Like, hey, why don't you offer a nuclear-heavy plan, so you can kind of support those technologies and everything. And Francine, I'll tell you what, when I first started the podcast, I didn't really think much about it, but I have become a huge supporter of energy storage. Okay, so not really the renewable stuff. I think that in order for renewables to really have take up a large portion of this portfolio that's on our grid, you have to have storage. You have to have a way to kind of offset whenever the wind's not blowing and the sun isn't shining for solar. And storage really kind of evens everything out, and it really evens out everything. I'm talking about when nuclear's going full scale and maybe there's not as much demand for it at night, but there is more in the middle of the day. Storage can kind of level all that out so that a lot of these energy storage sources like natural gas don't have to peak on and off throughout the day. Storage really levels that out. And one of the beautiful things about storage is you don't have to be a Fortune 10 company to get into the energy storage space. I mean, I profiled these smaller companies, $1 million to $50 million, companies that have developed these storage projects. And I think that for all those people who want to see the love kind of get spread around a little bit, there's a lot of companies out there who are doing a lot of interesting things who could, have very good livelihoods with a energy storage project. I think we're going to see a lot of that over the next decade or two.
Yes. And as a realtor now here, Jay, in the state of Florida, many buyers and sellers are now making their decisions on where they're going to live and invest in their homes and businesses based on the quality and reliability of that energy source that powers their community. So that's a very important factor going forward in our real estate is our energy sources in the community in which we live. Now, Jay, we got a little bit more time, but I also wanted to bring in our workforce development with all this new energy sourcing and upgrades on our grid and our vulnerabilities and our benefits. What type of career pathing for our next generation do we have facing us in the new energy industry workforce? What type of jobs should young people be looking for and studying to get a career going in the energy sector?
Francine, I think that's a great question, and I did a panel one time, and it was at UNC Chapel Hill, and one of the things I told those folks was like, look, these panelists here, a lot of them are startups, they're hiring, get their cards, meet these people. And I've had a few people reach out to me on my podcast saying like, hey, tell me, I'm interested in this sector. I want to know more about it. What do you like? And I've had some pretty nice calls with some of the listeners, and said like, look, hey, I've got these people's emails. It's like, get with me and I will make an introduction. I'll be happy to do it. So look, networking, as you know, is really important. But look, I went to LSU, loved that school. I majored in journalism, and I really do think that I graduated from high school probably about 4 years too early. This was really before all the oil prices started going up. And that was really when I kind of saw that energy was changing, that there's going to be a drastic move to renewables, a lot more interest in trying to find alternative sources of energy. And so really, hey, what I would say is if you are in high school and thinking about what to major in and you like this sector, I would probably say veer more towards the STEM fields, the science, the mathematics and everything, than maybe I did with communications. Because let me tell you, if you are a good communicator, don't worry about majoring in something like engineering. You will use it. In fact, if you are a good communicator and you've got those bona fides of doing an engineering degree or a STEM degree or something like that, I think you really will be untouchable, because you look at some of the management of the folks who are in this sector. They mostly are engineers. They mostly have that technical background there, but they aren't going to just look at their shoes all day, right? I mean, they kind of have a little bit of everything, both the right brain and the left brain. So that's what I would look. If I could go back 20 years in the time machine, I would have sucked it up, majored in mechanical engineering, and then tried to pursue more of a leadership role. I think I would have had a whole lot easier time with it than I did, I think, with a communications degree.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Jay. We have a bright future for our youth in our career path in the energy sector, with all the cyber terrorism, the cyber opportunities, the drone opportunities, and the maritime, which all affects our energy sources. So, Jay, it looks like we have a few minutes left, and I certainly appreciate your time today as we work with our families in our local communities in understanding that power source, their energy sources, especially COVID. What is the quality of air being transmitted to my home? The quality of the water and sewer. And, of course, we don't have enough time. We're out of time today. But we'll have you back to certainly talk about some of these areas so we can better educate our families. And we certainly believe nuclear is a good way forward with that near 0% carbon print. And so is there any additional information you can share with our listeners today to help them in this energy source space before we close?
Well, certainly listen to programs like yours, and certainly I welcome anyone to check out my podcast, available on all forms, iTunes, Android, just whatever you got. It's Energy Cast, 2 words, and energy-cast.com. It'll lead you to all the social medias, all the episodes and everything, and I hope you check it out. You might learn a thing or two. The guests I have are like Francina. They know a lot more than I do, so I'm always educated when I talk. I get educated myself when I'm talking to my guests.
Well, and so do I, and I guess that's one of our tenets in broadcasting, is being able to bring out the best information to our listeners. Mr. Jay Dauenhauer, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today and your wisdom on our energy sources as we pay it forward in this 21st century. It's a big part of our real estate. Thank you, Mr. Dauenhauer.
Thank you, Francina. Glad to be on. Thank you.
Thank you. And to all of our listeners, it's family time. It's time to get our energy sources for our homes in order. We must be a good steward of what our Heavenly Father has blessed us with. Until next week, same time, same station, Praise 107.9, Jacksonville, Florida. I am Francina Tate Holrest, your hostess.
Empower your family with the dynamic new book by Francina Holress, Our Sixth Sense and Purpose, The Power in Knowing Who You Are. It's the book that gives you insights into life's problems. Francina Holress is an author, motivational speaker, and national broadcaster who believes the answers to your problems lies within the knowledge that was once traditionally passed down by families. But that knowledge has been short-circuited by today's faster pace. The book, Our Sixth Sense and Purpose, The Power in Knowing Who You Are, brings that accumulated wisdom to the problems that all families face. You'll find your copy of Our Sixth Sense and Purpose, The Power in Knowing Who You Are at Amazon and at better bookstores. Empower your life with the dynamic new book, Our Sixth Sense and Purpose, The Power in Knowing Who You Are by Francina Holress.
Thank you for joining Francina Holress on Empowered Family Talk. Tune in next week.